Chapter 40. The World Wrestling Federation. Jim Barnett was always very high on me, and was constantly trying to entice me to come into the WWF. At the same time, he was also in Vince McMahon's ear, encouraging him to hire me. During the fall of 1984, Vince McMahon called me to thank me for helping him score the fabulous Freebirds in Kamala, and at the end of our conversation, he gave me his home phone number, and told me to give him a call when I was ready to make a move. When Ken Mantell began introducing Stella Mae French, I felt that the time was right, so I called Vince up and told him I was interested in jumping to the WWF. Vince was excited to hear that, and he invited me to come to a TV taping in St. Louis, Missouri, so we could speak more in depth. Tarzan Tyler was living in Dallas at the time, and we were friends because he had worked for me in Texas when I had the book. I told him I was looking to make a move to the WWF, and he said, "I know this kid from Montreal. He wrestles under the name of Cujo, is 6 feet 7 inches, weighs well over 350 pounds, and is very agile. If you meet with Vince McMahon, would you see if you could get him into the WWF, as well?" I had known Tarzan for many years, and he had always done right by me. If he wanted me to use whatever influence I had to get a friend of his booked with the WWF, I was happy to oblige. I asked him to send me some pictures of Cujo, and was impressed with his look. Picture John Tenta, and that's what Cujo looked like. I was really curious to see him perform in the ring, because if I liked what I saw, I knew I could develop him into a monster to challenge Hulk Hogan. I even came up with a gimmick for him, thinking it would be interesting to bill him as being from Guyana as the man who got away, a subtle reference to the mass suicide that took place in Jonestown 6 years earlier. I flew to St. Louis to meet with Vince at the Kiel Auditorium, and as soon as I walked into the building, Mr. Fuji approached me and loudly asked if I had any marijuana with me. I just looked at him and calmly said, "Fuji, I don't bring that stuff to the arena." I then stood in the hallway and waited to speak with Vince McMahon. Eventually, he came out of a room where he and George the Animal Steel were having a heated discussion. Vince and I started speaking, and, just as I had promised Tarzan, I showed him Cujo's pictures. Needless to say, Vince was impressed, because he likes monsters. The next thing I knew, George Steele interrupted, because he and Vince were in some kind of flux at the time, grabbed Vince, and pulled him back into the room to continue their discussion. The last thing Vince said to me was, "I'll see you and Cujo at our house show in Landover. Someone from my office will send you a plane ticket." I only got 3 minutes with Vince that night, and I didn't see him again. Sure enough, a few days later I received a plane ticket in the mail, and I flew into Washington, D.C. the evening of the show. As soon as I arrived at the airport, someone was paging my name through the loudspeaker, announcing that I had a phone call. When I picked up the phone, I heard, "Gary, you don't know me, but my name is Howard Finkel, and I work for Vince McMahon. There's been a mix-up and Cujo's plane will be late. Will you stay at the airport, meet him, and bring him with you to Landover for the show tonight?" Howard told me the gate Cujo was getting in at, and all the other pertinent information. I waited for an hour, but by 7:30 p.m., I was concerned because it was awfully close to show time and he still hadn't shown up. I found someone who worked at the airport and asked about the flight, and was informed that it had landed over 2 hours ago. I had a 45-minute drive from D.C. to Landover, so I immediately jumped in a cab and got to the arena by 8:30 p.m. As I walked in the building, the first person I saw was Hulk Hogan. He looked stunned when I walked through the door, and was clearly shocked to see me. He exclaimed, "What are you doing here?" It was the first and only time I ever met Hulk Hogan, and I sort of ignored and snubbed him, and I'm sure I came off as rude, because he was so nice to me and I was angry at someone else. I wish that I could have met him under a different set of circumstances, because I had always been really impressed with Hulk and was looking forward to meeting him. I found Cujo sitting with a bunch of other guys, and asked him how long he had been there. He pretended like he couldn't speak English, and it was clear to me that he didn't want to speak to me at all. I then saw Rene Goulet, who I knew for years because he had worked for me in Georgia and Texas, and I asked him how long Cujo had been there. As soon as he told me that Cujo had been there since show time, I knew I had been set up. I found Howard Finkel and asked him why he paged me at the airport and asked me to wait for Cujo at the airport when he was already at the building. Howard told me that was what he was instructed to do by Jay Strongbow. The next thing I knew, Jay Strongbow walked over to me screaming, "Why are you getting here so late?" I was trying to be on my best behavior, so I didn't respond to him, but I looked right at Howard and asked, "Does he have his stroke around here?" "Yes," Howard replied. "He's one of Vince's top guys." "Well, you tell Vince that if Jay Strongbow has any kind of power, I'm out of here, because I don't want anything to do with him." I found Bob Orton, Greg Valentine and Roddy Piper, who I was supposed to ride with to Poughkeepsie, New York, for a TV taping the next day, and told them I was leaving. I then picked up my bag and left the building. 2 days later, back in Dallas, I got a call from George Scott, who was Vince McMahon's booker, saying that he was calling from Vince's office. The first thing George said was, "Vince is really upset with you." "Oh, really?" I replied. "Is he upset that he's got some asshole on his staff who, all because I fired him 9 years ago in Georgia, tried to fuck me out of a job and left me sitting in an airport in Washington, D.C.? At that point, Vince got on the phone and said, "Gary, you came in and upset my dressing room." "I didn't upset anything," I told him. "I flew to Washington, D.C. on time and was left sitting at the airport by that fucking asshole Jay Strongbow, and if he has anything to do with the WWF, then I'm not interested in working there." "Well, I flew you in," Vince argued. "If that's what's bothering you, I'll send you the price of my ticket," I offered. "No, that won't be necessary," he said. "Here, talk to George." George got back on the line and explained that they ended up not hiring Cujo after all, because he didn't have his working papers. I told George that I was under the impression that Cujo and Tarzan Tyler had that taken care of that, so it was really out of my hands. After we got that out of the way, George eased up a bit and told me the offer to come into the WWF was still on the table, asking if I would be interested in managing Brutus Beefcake. "No, thank you," I said. "And thank Vince for the offer, as well. But I'm just not interested." That was the last contact I ever had with anyone from the WWF, and that was the way I left it. My experience with the WWF during that particular time, which was really just a brief moment, left a very bad taste in my mouth. After Vince asked me to come in and help out with talent, I was treated like some prelim jobber, and I had been in the business too long to be treated like that by anybody. I was never angry with Howard Finkel, because in his defense he didn't know who Cujo was and wouldn't have been able to pick him out of a lineup. However, I didn't want to put myself in a situation where my future depended on someone like Chief Jay Strongbow, who was clearly out for revenge for what had happened between us in Georgia 9 years ago. I also didn't like the first question that Mr. Fuji asked me in St. Louis, and I couldn't help but think he was also trying to set me up, still bitter over what had happened in Georgia, as well. It was like Stooge City, and while I respected guys like Arnold Skolland and Gorilla Monsoon, considering them to be top-of-the-line guys, the WWF dressing room during that time was a hellhole of politicians and locker room lawyers, and I could never have put myself in that kind of jeopardy. At that stage in my career, I didn't need to deal with game playing or shark-infested waters, and God only knows what kinds of things Strongbow and Fuji were telling Vince McMahon about me. It wasn't worth the aggravation, and therefore, I came to the conclusion that the WWF just wasn't for me.